The evacuation of Saigon in April 1975 succeeded in helping thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers escape further conflict and bloodshed as the North Vietnamese army advanced to Saigon. This stopped the American plan to compromise with North Vietnam and peacefully end the Vietnam War. On April 28, 1975, with North Vietnamese soldiers advancing toward the grand city of Saigon, thousands of American and South Vietnamese soldiers prepared to leave their comrades that were captured and arrested by North Vietnamese forces, their wives and children, and the place they called home for 25 years. The Paris Peace Accords was signed on an agreement to an effort to end the 20-year Vietnam War. It still ended in loss and defeat for South Vietnam, not only symbolizing the war, but also in the category of comrades and the people they fought and worked with. The Vietnam War started from China preaching North Vietnam the life as a communist country. The North loved the idea of having a stable way of controlling their citizens while giving them an opportunity to receive money to survive. The North wanted to preach it to South Vietnam, but the South didn't like the ways of communism. Soon after the disagreement, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of communism in Vietnam, and Nguyen Dinh Diem, the first president of South Vietnam, declared war against the two nations. North Vietnam was fighting to unify Vietnam as a communist country, while South Vietnam was fighting for Vietnam to become closely tied with the West. After 5 years had passed, the U.S. saw the action in Vietnam and noticed that if the North would win, it would then be a starting point in communism, which will spread through neighboring countries that would go on. This is now formally known as the Communist Domino Effect. The U.S. knew they had to do something, so they did. John F. Kennedy addressed South Vietnam that they were going to send troops to fight with them. The communists saw the companionship between South Vietnam and America and decided to recruit allies as well, known as the Viet Cong. The communists would go by villages, teaching them how to shoot a gun to making a bunker underground. They even taught children to fight as well. Whenever they heard these bells, they were recruited to hide using leaves. Some were even recruited to stand out in the field and shoot at nearby helicopters. This went on for 18 years until the U.S. and North Vietnam made an agreement through the Paris Peace Accords. Even though the North signed it, the U.S. expected for them to neglect the Paris Peace Accords, so they made a plan. If the North were to start the war again, they would give supplies to South Vietnam and fight their all. As expected, the North started the war once again to convince South Vietnam that communism is fair and the best way to run a country. The South didn't give in and fought with the supplies provided by the U.S. as promised. Suddenly, on August 8, 1974, former 37th President Richard Nixon resigned due to his involvement in the Watergate affair. This was a blessing for North Vietnam because they knew that Nixon would do anything to win the war. In a matter of months, North Vietnam invaded South territory faster than it did in all 19 years combined. They passed through from Quang Tri through Con Tum and finally to Binh Duong, a province near Saigon. Stationed there, South Vietnamese soldiers prepared for North Vietnam's army to come through the Tiên Giang province. As expected, they arrived one day later, bringing their energy of victory through the jungle. That day, the jungle, described by veterans, looked like it was raining blood. When they cleared the jungle, the North Vietnamese army passed through Vinh Long and finally into Gia Dinh province, where Saigon rested. Was all hope lost? Was all that the U.S. and South Vietnam did worth nothing? President Gerald Ford saw these questions and made a conclusion. He saw the advancements that the North conquered and agreed to get everyone that had ties to the army out of Vietnam by April 29, 1975. President Ford started the evacuation on April 21st. Hundreds of Vietnamese and Americans fled out of Saigon in the first 5 days. While this was happening, North Vietnamese soldiers marched through the fields, villages, and eventually onto the bridge of Saigon, which marked the border between them and a neighboring city called Da Nang. They didn't know it then, but the battle on that bridge would become the last thing being marked by U.S. blood. Gerald Ford, the former president, knew he only had a couple of days until North Vietnamese soldiers arrived, so he scrapped his plan to help escape all American and Vietnamese military personnel to just all American personnel. On August 29, 1975, North Vietnamese troops defeated the battle on the bridge and entered into Saigon. Suddenly, in the middle of Saigon, radios and news forecasts played White Christmas by Bing Crosby, symbolizing a code phrase. The code was, grab your loved ones and get on board a U.S. Air Force helicopter. The evacuation has begun.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas.
Immediately, thousands of people crossed the town square and rushed to the gates. People were praying to get over. After all the stress, women threw their children over the gate just to give them a chance to survive. Some women climbed over the gate with their children in luggage.
I was there just right before the Saigon. It fall. It's tough. It's just lucky. I would say it's really hard to get out. Just most people who live in Saigon, they want to get out. But I would say lucky 1 in 1,000 could get out of Vietnam.
If you got over, you would cross a pool where you would drop all your weapons and hitch a ride to safety. Helicopters boarded from 10 to 35 people. The North was getting closer by the minutes. American and Vietnamese cramped into the small rescue helicopter. Some people even went onto the runway and jumped into the moving vehicle, being dragged into the helicopter by flight attendants. People were flown to a nearby battleship where they would land. The ships got filled with helicopters and people in the first hour. They didn't know what to do to give space for more incoming helicopters. They knew the only way to give space was to eject helicopters off the ship and into the vast South China Sea. Back in Saigon, people were being lifted by helicopters. Then all of a sudden, the supply of lifts ended without a warning. People kept waiting on the roof of the U.S. Embassy, hoping more helicopters would come. Waiting and waiting for a miracle. They didn't know that if they escaped by boat and found the fleet of ships, they would be welcomed. Anyone who found them would be welcomed. The Vietnamese waiting on the U.S. Embassy roof knew that if the communists came in, the last thing they wanted to see was for them to be waiting there on the roof of the U.S. Embassy, so they went out and tried finding another way to escape. After radios broadcasted that Nguyen Van Thieu, known as the last president of South Vietnam, told all soldiers in and out of the battlefield to surrender unconditionally. All South Vietnamese soldiers immediately dropped their weapons and walked off the battlefield, making a path for the communists to enter into Saigon. When the communists arrived in Saigon, they were looking around in fascination and wonder at the grand city. South Vietnamese soldiers started to take off their clothes, signifying their loss. Things were getting better after the fleet in the South China Sea. They wanted to dock into the Philippines and wait there, but they had one big problem. They wouldn't let them in. The government in the Philippines realized a new regime in Vietnam. How did they know that they were South Vietnamese ships? The flag. They knew that the only way to enter the Philippines was to lower the South Vietnamese flag and raise the American flag.
Thì chúng tôi có trình với lại ông đô đốc của cái đoàn tàu trên đệ thất hạm đội đó. Thì chúng tôi có đề nghị làm một cuộc lễ hạ cờ của chúng tôi xuống và kéo cờ của Hoa Kỳ lên. Này công dân ơi, đứng lên đáp lời sông núi, đồng lòng cùng đi hy sinh tiếc gì thân sông. Thấy trùng lại và mới thấy thấm thía rằng lúc này đúng là mình đã mất nước, đã mất hết.
The South Vietnamese people knew that they lost the war over and over again, but the lowering of their flag signified the end of the South Vietnamese government. Once they docked into the Philippines, they were provided food, shelter, and medical care. Not all people were lucky. People that had connection to the army and religious leaders were dragged off the streets, thrown into trucks, and sent far away to re-education camps, where they would learn the ways of the new government. At the education camps, they were tortured, brutally taught, and even publicly executed. Sometimes people need to rise up to the occasion and fight through their heart and into the battlefield. There are no shortage of those people in the Vietnam War. The evacuation of Saigon is a monument in history that recognizes conflict and compromise, not only in the war, but the mindset of the Vietnamese and Americans that fought in the war, hoping to come out alive.